Welcome back to another episode about applied behaviour analysis. Throughout this episode, I'm going to discuss the fundamentals of what the applied behaviour analysis principles are based upon, of what their techniques and where they come from. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt turned psychology from a philosophy into a science discipline. But then as we got to the 20th century, someone called John Watson, he decided to criticise Wilhelm Wundt's use of introspection because it turned out to have been too subjective, where all the results were subjective and they couldn't come to an objective scientific answer. So he criticised it and decided to go into only observing observable and measurable behaviours, and that's where the behavioural principle, the seventh dimension of ABA, came from John Watson. And if you've studied psychology, you most likely know who Ivan Pavlov is through classical conditioning, and who Boris Frederick Skinner is through operant conditioning. These are the two main concepts that ABA is based upon. If we're to say it in the kind of day-to-day language, basically ABA is all about bribes and threats to get obedience and temporary compliance. That's ABA's main goal, is to make people comply. Sometimes it's even called compliance training. All these programs that they use in schools. So you'll sometimes hear an ABA therapist say, everyone does ABA. But does everyone do it? The truth is no, we don't. So, on classical conditioning first by Ivan Pavlov was to do with learning by association. And there was a very unethical project done called Little Albert. On Little Albert, there was a boy who had no fear of mice. He had no fear of them whatsoever. But what John Watson did was he put this young boy with a white mouse and made an unexpected frightening noise near the boy. And then eventually, after doing it so many times, the young boy associated this frightening noise with the mouse, that whenever he saw the mouse, it reminded him of the frightening noise that he was frightened of the mouse. And then anything which he associated with the mouse or with that sound, he became phobic to it. And this is the kind of way of how phobic behaviours develop. They develop through classical conditioning, through people making association. Like, say where people generalise certain cults or certain religions. Like, some people may be fearful of a Muslim because they've associated a crime that they've heard a Muslim's done. Like not too long ago, several years ago before the pandemic, there was a Muslim who came into my country. He went to a place called Manchester with some bomb on himself, and he exploded it and then killed about 13 children by the cinema. And then there's some people who've gone and generalised all Muslims as that they now fear Muslims by associating Muslims with this event. Just like this young boy at Little Albert associated that frightening noise with the mouse. And then this boy became frightened of things like Santa Claus's white beard. Anything white, fluffy and flary and fairy, the boy became frightened of and phobic. So that's the first one, classical conditioning, which is used in applied behaviour analysis. And the second one, operant conditioning by Boris Frederick Skinner, is often laid out through a sequence of A, B, C, where the A stands for antecedent, the B stands for behaviour, and the C stands for consequence. Because B.F. Skinner believed that free will is an illusion, motivation's an illusion, which is why ABA doesn't care about free will, which is why it thinks kids don't deserve free will or autonomy, because they don't even believe in it, ABA. And it feels that everything we do is shaped by the consequences of our previous action, of what we did before. But we don't have control of ourselves. For example, the antecedent is the cause of a behaviour, and the B is the behaviour itself, and the C is the consequence of that behaviour. So, says you do something that makes you tired, the tiredness is what causes the sleep. So tiredness is the antecedent, going to sleep is the behaviour, and getting rest is the consequence. And this leads to what we call reinforcement in the behaviourist framework, in the behaviourist approach in psychology. They think that all of our actions are reinforced, that we are subject to reinforcers. If the consequence is positive, we are more likely to repeat the action. If we find it negative, we are less likely to repeat the action. So the belief that we are controlled by consequences and not controlled by conscious actions. We can't think to ourselves that, it's worth facing the consequence this time, but we won't do it the next time. Thinking about we don't have a conscience. ABA. That's what ABA officially believes, as they are stuck with classical and operant conditioning. And then as we go further down the lines inside the behaviourist approach, they have 4 fundamental beliefs in their approach, which we know today are absolutely science fiction. For example, one of them is to believe only observable and measurable things are to be observed. 2, they believe humans are essentially the same as other critters, other animals, no differences between us whatsoever. 3rd, they believe we come in this world as a clean slate and know nothing. And 4, they believe that our genes have no influence on behaviour. So the phenotypes and so on, which we see in biopsychology, apparently biopsychology is pseudoscience, according to our behaviourists, according to the behaviourist approach. So behaviourists already are well out of date, and B.F. Skinner, even he himself could actually say he was a bit ahead of his own time even, B.F. Skinner was. That's why he was a psychologist of his day, and had already proven that so many claims of ABA as falsehood, because Oliver Lovaz is the founder of ABA, but he based his work on B.F. Skinner and Ivan Pavlov, and he went intentionally contradicting Skinner, because Oliver Lovaz was using physical punishments like beating kids up, giving kids electronic shocks. But Boris Frederick Skinner, from his work on rodents and pigeons, what he had already discovered was that punishments don't make a person any less inclined to perform a behaviour. At best, it makes them learn to avoid the punishment, and actually causes dishonesty. But Oliver Lovaz went saying the opposite and claimed that that was wrong. And then B.F. Skinner's claim about punishments not, making a person no less inclined is actually further supported by a psychologist called Albert Bandura, famous for what's called the Bobo doll study. he came up with what's called the social learning theory in psychology. We'll discuss that on a later episode. But yes, Albert Bandura's work on his social learning theory actually supports and provides more evidence that punishments actually increase the likelihood of someone wanting to do that behaviour. The more you punish someone, the more inclined to the behaviour they become. But the more you reward someone, the less inclined they become. That sounds rather counterintuitive, doesn't it? I was surprised to learn that myself, however. But Ivan Oliver Lovas, for example, he still went using punishments in ABA, even though B.F. Skinner had already proven punishments do not work. Because when he was doing it on the rodents, he calls this the gambling period, is what B.F. Skinner called that. It was where at times, sometimes they'll get the reward, sometimes they won't. You'll find an ABA therapist call this fading, where they persistently reward the kids and then they gradually reduce how often they reward children for doing the task that they are requested to do, or that they have been demanded to do, to be more honest. They'll gradually reduce how often, how frequently they reward the kid, and we'll call this fading. But then eventually, the children figure out they're never going to be rewarded for it again. And B.F. Skinner, when the rodents kept pushing levers inside the cage, eventually he noticed they were doing it, but not always getting the reward. So sometimes they didn't bother, sometimes they did. But eventually they figured out they were never going to get the pellets shooting at them again. But once they figured that out, they had no fear to do the behaviour. They were willing to behave that way again. And it works the same way with punishments and rewards. But once they figure out they're not getting the reward anymore, they stop doing the behaviour. Because their goal never was independence to begin with. The child's goal was obtain the reward. And that's one of the big flaws inside applied behaviour analysis. It is the fact of the matter that the child's got one goal, but the therapist has a different goal. While the therapists are going and claiming they're trying to help the kids become independent, that's actually flawed in itself, first of all. And they give the children a different goal. The child's goal is to obtain the reward. So the therapist now thinks that they've done all their work, they've done all they need to do, but the child's reached his goal of obtaining the reward. But now that the therapist is gone, the therapist has not seen the final results. Because this child was never aiming for independence to begin with, the child is no more independent than they were from the start. Because they never were aiming for independence, they were aiming to get a reward. And that's one of the big flaws of applied behaviour analysis. They're sending the children in the opposite direction, all the way from the beginning. And then the other point I have of what makes this so flawed is where they go claiming, oh, we're trying to make them independent. I ask you all this. If you're a parent of a child who's not disabled, how many of you actually tried to make your 2-year-old child independent? Were you trying to teach your 2-year-old how to go to the shops by themselves? Were you trying to teach a 2-year-old how to get a bath by himself? Were you trying to teach a 2-year-old how to do all the housework? Were you trying to teach 2-year-olds all the things that adults are meant to do in the home? I can safely assume no, because you wouldn't see it as relevant. So why must ABA teach kids to do such tasks? Why must it be 2-year-olds doing all the housework? training a 2-year-old to do housework. Why not wait until the child gets to an efficient age? So by them being so obsessed with independence and being so narrow-minded, we're already getting 2-year-olds doing things that 2-year-olds in general don't do. They go making claims like, we want to prepare them for employment, so we want to make them make eye contact. Well, what, you're teaching a 2-year-old for employment? They are well aware from getting employed anytime soon. And with the employment discrimination that goes on, it's quite ridiculous trying to train a 2-year-old to get employed. So it's pretty clear at applied behaviour analysis that their skills are very out of place. Their goals and priorities are very out of order. I wouldn't think about teaching a child the kind of things that adults are expected to do. I would teach a child the things which children are expected to do. I wouldn't go holding autistic kids to a higher standard than non-disabled kids. I would hold them to the same standards. I wouldn't go holding a non-autistic 2-year-old to being helped by the parents, but then say that an autistic 2-year-old is not worthy of help from their parents. But this is what ABA does. It's all about bribes and threats to get obedience. It's all manipulation. And when you think of manipulation, that's someone controlling you. And when someone's controlling you, that means you don't have free will. Someone's controlling you, and that's what B.F. Skinner meant when he said about he doesn't believe in free will. Because he believes that other people are controlling us, that we don't control ourselves. That's ABA's belief, that everything you do is controlled by the environment. So really, according to an ABA therapist, we shouldn't be putting murderers in jail, according to an ABA therapist, because it wasn't the person that chose to murder. The environment told the person to murder. The environment is the murderer, not the person. What nonsense ABA is full of. ABA is full of absolute nonsense. They make the most ridiculous claims to the ABA therapist who try to defend it. If you talk with a therapist and raise concerns that you may have, such as ask them, for example, something like, but will my child still do this in the future when they're not going to get rewarded for it? My child's only doing this behaviour because you're rewarding him. Will my child still do this behaviour in the future? But as soon as you raise those concerns, you've got that gut instinct inside you that bribing your kid, threatening your kid, you've got that gut instinct inside you, there's something wrong about it, that something's not right. But you've got the therapist saying to you, no, this is the only evidence base, it's the only one that works. But that is entirely not true. There's other interventions that do work, but sadly, with ABA being the big money scam, it's got its place on the market. Through the fear-mongering of hate groups like Autism Speaks, it's why ABA and Autism Speaks work together. They work together because they are both part of the money scam. Autism Speaks spends less than 1% funding to actually increase the quality of life of autistic people and to provide support for their families. 99% of it goes towards commercial profiteering, genomic research, searching for cures, when all that money could be ensuring other interventions and preventing parents being bankrupt. But sadly now, ABA is just a money scam that they won't let you ask them questions. They'll make the most ridiculous claims when you raise concerns about their techniques. Such as, for example, say if you're questioned about conditional acceptance, said about what is my child perceiving me doing to them, what's my child hearing from my behaviour? They say behaviour is communication. So what is my behaviour telling my child? When you tell me to do this, what is that saying to my child? And then if you actually think it through, you come to see that your child is hearing, since you only show them affection when they do what you want them to do. Basically what they're hearing from you is, I will only love you when you jump through my hoops. I do not love you for who you are. Son, daughter, I don't love you. I will only love you if you do what I want you to do. If you raise a concern like that to an ABA therapist, they'll make up the most ridiculous excuses for your concerns to stick with outdated, falsehood, proven wrong, operant conditioning and classical conditioning, just because it successfully manipulates a child's behaviour. And personally, I think it is morally objectionable to manipulate people, as this actually results in all these autistic kids become more vulnerable to abuse due to all the manipulation. It's so easy for a stranger to manipulate an autistic child who's been through ABA, persistently being manipulated. So the ABA principles and what it's based upon is basically bribes, threats and manipulation. That's what ABA is entirely based upon. I'll be talking a bit more about Albert Bandura in a later episode, to show how things progressed and so on, of how he proved B.F. Skinner was incorrect in the long run, of how some of his work supported some of B.F. Skinner's claims. We'll talk more about that in a later episode of ABA. But I advise you all, if you've got a child and they're going to go into ABA, do not fear to raise your concerns and demand answers from them, from the therapists. But sadly, these therapists come up with ridiculous claims because they are not even educated in psychology. They have illustrated this to me numerous times online. For example, they tell me everyone needs to comply, but we all need compliance. But the truth is, no, we don't. No one's got to comply. I then ask them, why does everyone have to comply? And they get things like answers, say, oh, but if you go on a public premises, you've got to follow the rules that the manager set. I've then got to point out to the therapist, oh, behaviour technician, BCBA, that is not compliance. That is obedience. Compliance is a social influence. Obedience is direct orders. The rules you've just recommended, that is someone having to follow direct orders. That's obedience. I agree with you there. Like, yes, we need to obey the rules and regulations, laws of our countries, but we don't have to comply and go along with something we disagree with. As long as they are not rules or anything, we don't have to go along with the flow. So the fact that ABA therapists don't even know the difference between compliance and obedience shows how much of a lack of education ABA therapists have, as they are so isolated in their little chamber, in their little bubble. They are also narrow, no other disciplines brought in the field. They're just in their little life bubble. They're just so uneducated. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about applied behaviour analysis, hang around and I'll discuss more in later episodes. Thank you.